Row, row, row your boat, but you won't be able to row fast enough, because that thing in the water that pulled your friend under, well, it's faster than any boat you've ever seen. Today, I've got some allegedly true and especially scary stories about fishing trips gone terribly wrong. Remember, if you'd like a chance to have your story narrated, share it with us at darkstories.org. Also, follow the Darkness Prevails podcast on Spotify and iTunes, if you'd rather listen audio only. And if you want to support the show for free, leave us a review on iTunes too. Thank you. Now, let's begin. Something tried to drown fishers. From J. Ion. My family originated from a remote island that is covered in dense forests, with rolling hills and an abundance of lakes and rivers. Most people on the island grow their own vegetables and fruits, hunt for meats, and fish for food. My family was no exception. My grandfather sometimes would take my mother and her siblings on fishing trips out in the sea for at least half a day, where they'd catch anything from fish to squid to prawns and even crabs. Suffice to say, the island was plentiful with vegetation, and the waters surrounding it were bountiful. Because of the islanders' reliance on nature to provide sustenance, everyone was an expert at hiking, trekking, climbing, and of course, swimming. That's why, on the island, there are children as young as 10 who would go into the forests to search for fruits or fish at a stream unsupervised by an adult. Children below that age would often be brought to fishing or hunting trips by their parents, so they could learn these skills gradually. When my aunt was just 4 years old, she accompanied my grandfather on a fishing trip just a couple of miles from the coastline. As she was very small, she just sat on the boat while my grandfather did the fishing. She remembers an experience when she was younger. She was sitting on the boat, not moving while looking at my grandfather, and the next thing she knew, she was underwater and couldn't see a thing. Fortunately, my grandfather, who had his back to my aunt, had heard a loud splash and noticed that his child was gone. He quickly dove in, grabbed my aunt, and shoved her back onto the boat. The fishing trip was cut short, and when they got back on land, my grandfather scolded my aunt for being stupid by jumping around on a moving boat when she knew better. My aunt didn't say anything, because she honestly had no idea how she ended up in the water. She swears to this day that she was sitting still on the boat when she suddenly ended up almost drowning. My aunt then never accompanied my grandfather on his fishing trips. For his subsequent fishing trip, my grandfather decided to bring his older children along, my mother and uncle, who were 7 years old and 6 years old respectively. He instructed them to sit still in the boat and only assist him when he asked them, which they obeyed. My grandmother was on the shore, watching them fish, while she collected some clams. All of a sudden, my mother was in the water, flailing about for her life. When my uncle tried to save my mother by grabbing her arm, he somehow ended up falling into the water too. Both of them were struggling to keep their heads afloat so they could not cry out for help. My grandmother saw them fall into the sea and began to scream at my grandfather to save his children. My grandfather was so engrossed in his fishing that he did not hear anything until my grandmother was yelling at him. When he finally turned to look, he only saw my mother's and uncle's hands moving on the surface of the water before both were completely submerged. My grandfather then jumped into the water, swam over, and dragged both of them to shore, where my grandmother was crying and shouting her children's names frantically. On the shore, my grandmother hugged her children and quickly bundled them up and carried them back home. After a bath and some herbal tea, my grandmother determined that my mother and uncle were all right, and she began to calm down. As a result of the incident, my mother and uncle have a fear of swimming in the sea, even as adults. It's not just the sea surrounding the island that is bountiful. The many rivers and streams that flow into the sea have abundant stock of fish, which is where people who live further inland usually catch their meals. One day, a teenager from a village located deep in the woods went fishing at the river that ran parallel to his hometown. The river, though on the small side, provided enough fish and shellfish for the inhabitants of the village next to it. It was late afternoon when the teenager was instructed by his mother to catch some fish for dinner, so he got on a skiff, which he attached one end of a rope to, and tied the other end on a post on shore. This way he could fish on the same spot without worrying about being washed out to the open sea. He already caught some when he noticed something odd. Being so attuned to the nature of the island, he realized that the air and water were eerily still. He was on a flowing river, so it was impossible for his surroundings to be so silent. Even the air felt stationary. No sounds of birds, insects, not even a breeze. He decided then was a good time to get home. He stood up so that he could pull the rope to get back to the shore. Then he noticed an unusually dark mass in the water, 6 feet in front of him. The dark mass stayed in the same spot for a few seconds before it slowly emerged. The teenager was horrified to realize that it was long black hair attached to a head that was slowly surfacing from the water. Soon, a face could be seen. It was the most terrifying sight a human could behold. The head looked as if it belonged to a female, but the face consisted of rotting flesh, of gray-green and brown colors, where skin should be. The eyes and cheeks were sunken in, but the most horrifying parts of the face were its mouth and eyes. The mouth consisted of rotten pointy teeth on inflamed-looking gums, which were framed by thin, stretched-out black lips in a snarl. The eyes were slimy and bloodshot, with eyelids that were pitch black. But the worst part of all that was the expression it wore. The creature looked at the teenager with such intense hatred and anger, as though it was extremely offended by the teenager disrupting its nefarious plans by noticing its presence. The creature and the teenager stared at each other for several minutes before the creature slowly submerged itself and disappeared. The teenager did not dare to move. He was so frightened that he just stood there in his skiff, frozen like a statue. After an indeterminate amount of time, he heard his cousins calling his name. After taking much longer than usual, the teenager's mother got worried and sent his cousins to check up on the boy, where they knew he usually fished. Despite having company, he was still too afraid to move. He told his cousins to pull his skiff onto the riverbank for him. He took whatever fish he caught and went home with his cousins. He told his village elders what he witnessed later on that evening, and the story spread across the island. A relative who heard of the tale speculated that the creature might be the thing responsible for my mother, uncle, and aunt falling inexplicably into the sea and almost drowning. After all, the rivers and streams on the island all connect to the sea, so it would not be a stretch to imagine the creature traveling between different bodies of water that were connected to seek its prey. This relative believed that the creature was either an ancient water demon, or maybe it was the putrefied spirit of a drowned woman who needed to drown others in order to replace her in the watery grave, and thus allow her to move on. It has been 50 years since my mother and her siblings were almost drowned. Our fingers are crossed hoping that the creature did not succeed in drowning someone. Regardless of it being a murderous demon or a trapped spirit, death by drowning is a nasty way to go, especially when it's so unwarranted. It was smelling me. From Sandy L. I had an incident in the San Juan Mountains that made it impossible for me to ever go camping again. I'll try to keep it short. I used to go camping every summer, alone, just to get some time to myself and do some fishing, take some pictures, and just soak up the beauty of Colorado. I went to the same place every year as I knew it well, and the same couple managed the campground. The path I would take was moderately traveled, and also had people on horses a lot, as the first section of the trail is steep, rocky, and can have severe flash flooding in mere minutes. The morning I headed out, I remembered my sidearm, but forgot my camera. By the time I realized I'd forgotten it, I was already miles away from the sign-in sheet and the parking area. I started my hike at around 0600, because monsoon rains can start as early as 1000 that time of year, and can creep up on you because the mountains do a great job of blocking out the skies, so you can't see the approaching and accumulating storm clouds. I got to the bottom of the mountain, which is the first part of the hike, and it takes the longest because of the narrow, rocky path and the switchbacks along with other foot traffic. At this point, there's fence you have to cross, along with a small valley, a patch of trees with a small stream, then another smaller valley, and then you go on to the next mountain ascent. I usually don't go past the second valley because I like to fish the small creek, eat my catch for lunch, and then catch a few for dinner. This particular area has good brookie and cutthroat trout. I crossed over the fence and started into the first valley when I heard a noise behind me. I turned to see 5 riders on their horses approaching the fence. I threw my hand up and they did the same. I stopped right where I was and took my pack off. I wanted to see where they were headed. If they were there to do some fishing too, I wanted to make sure I went far enough upstream to have a section of stream to myself. We chatted for about 20 minutes or so before they tipped their hats and wished me luck on my trip. I bid them farewell, grabbed my pack, and headed to the tree section and to my spot. The trail riders were going to another section of the next mountain, so I had the whole stream to myself. So I thought. I got to the area that I absolutely loved. I threw my pack down and started to get my gear together. I found 5 good-sized brookie not far from where I had set up for lunch. This pleased me, because I didn't want to have to walk far for my supplies. The fishing that morning was nothing short of wonderful. I caught all 5 of the brookie and 1 cutthroat before I cleaned up, packed up, and started to head back. I was about 4 hours away from the parking area, because the return trip takes longer due to the almost vertical climb back up the mountain. I had cleared the tree area and was crossing the valley towards the fence when I heard a branch snap. For whatever reason, this made me stop and not look behind me but look up. This is when I noticed the clouds were rolling in, and from the looks of them, I was about to get really wet. Meanwhile, the branch snap, I reasoned with myself, was the riders on their way back through because they must have noticed the ominous clouds as well. Rummaging through my pack, I found my rain slick and my jeans. Standing in the field, I changed my clothes and stuffed my shorts in my pack, zipping it up, and started once again for the fence. Another broken branch. This one was really loud and really close. I froze. I felt like I had just stepped in wet cement, and it had started to solidify. I slowly turned my head to look behind me. Nothing was there, but I had this sinking feeling I was being observed, followed, hunted. And there I was, right out in the open. No cover, no trees, fresh fish in my pack, and a bright yellow rain parka. I might as well have had a neon orange bullseye painted on my back. My mind went from thinking of the worst possible scenario, because I foolishly again thought maybe it was the riders coming through the tree patch. That thought was quickly replaced with the downright most terrifying vision I've ever seen. Breaking through the patch of trees was an animal. No, not even close. It was this beast with antlers, patchy hair, and teeth so big they were visible from where I was standing. I was already about to literally soil my newly donned pair of pants when this thing stood up on 2 legs and let out a scream that shook me to my very core. I reached for my sidearm, dropped my pack, and readied myself to run. But I couldn't have been more frozen in place than if I was in the first layer of snow on a 12,000-foot peak with 20 feet of ice on top of me. I literally couldn't move, couldn't take my eyes off of this thing. I began to cry. All of my life events started to vividly run through my head. Had I disturbed something in the woods while fishing? Was this how it was going to end for me? Would anyone find any trace of me? Could I get to the fence and over it before being attacked? Was this going to hurt? I'm full on crying at this point, the cool metal of my gun trembling in my jello hand. All of a sudden, I had no energy, no sense of my surroundings. The world was spinning at such a fast pace I could no longer hold focus on this atrocity that was about to end me. Of that I was sure. The only thing that was certain was that I was about to die. That feeling kept me from passing right the heck out. I'm standing there in the middle of this valley fighting to stay conscious, because if I do pass out, they, my family, will never see me again. That thing, it started to come towards me. It took a few steps and then stopped. I was still cemented to the ground. Time, weather, daylight, the wind, none of that was a factor for me right now. All I could do was stare at this thing. Those teeth, that would be the last thing I saw in this world. I could hear it in my mind, my bones crushing as it tore me apart. I couldn't bear it anymore. I sucked in a deep breath hard. My lungs felt as if they would explode. I raised my gun. I let the breath escape my lips, and I squeezed the trigger. Nothing. No movement at all. That creature standing there on its back legs raised its front legs like they were arms and waved them towards its face, as if to sniff the air. I could see its disgusting tongue lick its lips. It was as if it was happening in slow motion, to the point I could see that wet lump of flesh, its tongue, part its lips and caress over each dry crevice of skin on that filthy mouth. Continuing to stare at one another in this standoff, I realized I was going to have to make a break for it. What did I have to lose? I'd probably die either way, but I'd be darned if I was going to just stand there and make it easy for this thing. I kept my gun in my hand and left my pack behind. I slowly turned my head and judged the distance of that fence. For some reason, the fence felt like a safety zone. I looked back at my nemesis one more time, just to see it wave its hands in front of its face again, testing my scent. One more step forward was all it took to snap me out of it. I turned and ran as fast as I could towards the fence. I imagined it on all fours now, gaining on me, 10 steps to my every one. I didn't care. I was at least going to try. It was getting dark out by this point. I had seemingly stood in that spot for hours. I made it to the fence, grabbed it with my bare hands, and started to climb over it. No time for unhooking it for a clean pass-through. The barbed wire sunk deep into my palm, but I didn't scream. I used the pain as a motivator to get myself over that fence. Just as I cleared it, that creature was there. It stood up on its hind legs and waved its hands in front of its horribly deformed face once more. I was sobbing at this point. I just wanted to be home. I was kicking myself for going there alone. It stared at me for a long time. My assumption about the fence must have been right. For whatever reason, it didn't attempt to cross it. But it did walk back and forth, sniffing the air and licking those awful lips. The wet sound of each pull of its tongue was just nauseating. I thought about trying to shoot it again, but what if that angered it even more? No, I felt safe here. I stood up and looked around me. It was dusk, and it was getting hard to see. Great. I was going to be stuck out here all night with this creature hunting me. I walked backward to the head of the trail, watching it watching me. I stood there for a bit longer, making sure it wasn't going to come over the fence. Then, as all I could see was its bright yellow eyes, I turned up the path and got the heck out of there, still hearing its breathing and sniffing of the air. I ran as long as I could. It's a tough trail going back, very steep and rocky. I made shortcuts where I could, and only stopped to let the stitch in my side relax a bit before breaking out into a full run again. I made it about halfway up the trail before the realization of the events took over and I collapsed. I don't know if it was out of fear I felt or exhaustion or both. My legs were jello. My mind was broken. What in the world was that thing? The patches of fur, the sharp, jagged teeth, the walking on two legs, sniffing the air, tasting me in the air. My mind was just broken. I cried myself to sleep under the scrub oak. I startled awake at the sound of snapping branches. Dear God, no. I sat there knowing that if it had followed me, I was done for. There was no way I could outrun it now, going up this mountain. Shivering, a single tear made its way down my cheek. The fight in me was gone. I'd given it my best. If this was how I was going out, I wasn't going down without a fight. I unholstered my .45 and stood up, listening for the faintest of noise. I heard a familiar voice. Thank God, it was the riders. As they approached me, I collapsed again on the trail. They dismounted their horses and came running up to me, asking if I was okay. I was a muttering mess. I told them what happened, and they were quiet until I finished sobbing, pausing, talking, sobbing some more, talking, screaming, talking. They had found my pack and had seen where I bloodied my hands on the fence. Their horses began to act difficult. They stated they had issues with them, so decided to turn around, cutting their scouting trip short. I told them everything. They placed me on one of their horses and helped me get back to my truck. Before parting ways, one of the older gentlemen pulled me aside. He told me a short story of how he had seen a similar thing in the woods not far from where I'd been when he was out alone, fishing that very same creek. I felt relieved that he believed me and that I wasn't the only person to have that experience. I wrote a note on the sign-in sheet. I didn't care who saw it. I felt compelled to warn others of what I'd seen. It goes without saying I didn't sleep the rest of that night. As soon as light broke, I threw my tent with everything in it in my truck and got the heck out of there. I haven't been camping since, and I never will. I've no clue what it was. The gentleman that talked to me suggested a Wendigo or skinwalker. I don't know. I only know what I saw. But never again will I ever go camping. A Red Flash from H.M. When I was roughly around 6 years old, I used to go fishing with my grandparents. One day while my grandma and I were pulling out one of our nets, I got an uneasy feeling, like something was watching me. The wind began to pick up pace when we finished, and that's when I heard it. It was very faint, but I swear I heard a scream. All the fish we pulled out that day were just skeletal remains too, apart from a few seashells. I still felt like something was watching me, even as we were driving back. I started feeling nauseous, which was weird, since I've never gotten seasick before. The strange feeling wouldn't go away, and when I closed my eyes due to feeling very sick, all I saw was a blurry pair of big black eyes. They looked dull, yet somehow they gave me this weird feeling. When I opened my eyes, all I saw was a flash of red in the water. Not blood red, but rather a bromine red color. I started frantically blinking, trying to see if it was my imagination, but every time I blinked, I saw those dark eyes. And then I noticed that my grandma was staring at me. I could barely stutter a, "Granny, what's wrong?" but my question had no answer. She stood up from the helm and started walking towards me. And then I realized the boat wasn't moving. I tried to run and hide, but I couldn't move. She just picked me up and threw me overboard. And as I hit the water, I saw those eyes again. I was roughly 30 meters away from the shore, but it felt as if I was kilometers away. As I was trying to swim to shore, I saw another flash of red, this time mixing with another shade of red. My blood. When I eventually got to the shore, I finally felt the pain in my leg. The lower part of my left leg was slashed up. I ended up having to have stitches. I don't know what it was. We don't have sharks or anything like that in our part of the sea. But this gave me a fear of the deep which still lingers within me. As for why my grandma threw me overboard, not even she knows why. It was as if something came over her and took control of her, something that wanted me in the water. Sometimes when I try to sleep, I can still see those eyes staring directly at me. Random Thing in the Random Cave, from Eugene H. I live in rural Vermont. I'm not the best at telling people what happened to me, because it still makes me feel uneasy. Well, when I was younger, I used to fish a lot, and I used to travel all over Vermont looking for good fishing territory and new cool honey holes for big trout. Little did I know trout would be the last thing on my mind that day. Well, I was in Jeffersonville following a creek by my house, and I saw what I thought was a black bear. But something was wrong with it. This black bear appeared to be mangy or diseased. It was really big, about 8 feet long, but I could see raw muscle poking through the skin, where the skin seemingly had fallen away. Apparently it was injured, with huge pieces of meat just hanging off of it in a couple of places. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The bear paid me no mind and kept going on its way. I decided to keep going my own way up the stream, hoping that I don't run into it again. I wasn't so lucky. I found a nice deep pocket of water under an overhanging rock, making a kind of waterfall-covered cave area, and I thought it would be a cool spot to take some photos and just explore a little, being curious. After about 15 minutes in this little cave, I hear a strange and creepy sound. Something seemed to be huffing, and then it grunted. I looked up to see that monstrosity coming around the corner of the entrance to the cave area, which had no other entrance and was about 15 feet up from this pocket of water. Remembering my sidearm, I pulled out my magnum and fired, causing it to fall back, but instead of going down, the creature reared up. I was using spread loader cartridges for the magnum. I quickly fumbled in my pocket for the loader and slammed another 6 into it. I fired again, easily hitting it while it stood up. Now at this point, my hearing wasn't the best because of the gunshots, but I swear I heard it laugh. Yeah, this thing seemed to laugh at me. Its voice wasn't a human tone or an animal tone like you'd expect, but something in between, a deep, raspy and hoarse laugh. I nearly fainted right there, but as I stared at it, its face started to shift, and the eyes suddenly were nearly human, but they had a very red color to them like an albino. I was scared to death, and realizing I had one 6-round cartridge left, bullets that weren't even doing anything, I knew I was out of options. I stared on in horror as that creature lowered back down and started to charge at me. I remember it slamming into me like a Mack truck, hot breath and stench colliding with me, the pain of its claws hitting my arm, sending me over the ledge of the cliff, falling about 15 feet into the water. From there, things go black. What I remember next is waking up 2 miles downstream. I'm 30 feet from the river in the middle of a field somehow, with nasty claw marks on my shoulder, but I was alive. Still horrified, I reloaded my sidearm, just in case, then began a terrifying long walk back to my car. When I drove away from there, I swore to never go back.